How does the uniquely Austrian insight that value is an experience help businesses in the new hyper-connected world of the Internet of Things? Brilliantly.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We're here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. The Austrian principle of economic subjectivism helps us think better about every aspect of business by always thinking from the perspective of the individual customer. One of the principal areas of our application and ideation is value. Businesses don't create value. It's an experience in the mind of the customer. That word experience is important. It tells us that value is not a number, and it's not measurable, and it's not a point in time. It plays out over an extended period. It's a process, as Mark Packard told us. It also takes place in context. The context may be family, or the home, or the gym, or the office. The value experience changes depending on the context. And it can have different situational traits. If the situation is urgent, for example, there'll be a different customer feeling than if the situation is relaxed. It'll be different if the customer is with friends and family or in the office with colleagues. Value also emerges within the systems that customers assemble for themselves. Value can't result from the use of one product or one service. A household is a system. An office is a system. A meeting is a system. A hospital is a system. We can grab a cup of coffee inside all of those systems, and the experience is going to be different each time. And now comes a new twist on value as an experience, and that's the interconnected world of sensors and data flows we call the Internet of Things. The systems in which we experience value can now collect and send data about our experience that can be utilized to further enhance that experience. It's the digitization of feedback loops. It opens up a new world of experience design because we've got new data and insights to design with. We are privileged today to talk to Irene Ng. Irene is the perfect guest for our podcast, a CEO and a professor. She's CEO of DataSwift, where she created the hub of all things, HAT, and the personal data account, which gives each of us our own personal server for storage and control of our personal data. She's a professor at the University of Warwick and a senior member of Wolfson College, Cambridge, as well as a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. She specializes in the economic design and engineering of data markets and ecosystems. She's a successful entrepreneur many times over, and she incubates and invests in startups. Irene, welcome to the Economics for Business podcast.
Glad to be here.
Well, it's a great pleasure for us. We're going to talk about how businesses can design high-value consumer experiences in the era of the Internet of Things, or IoT as it gets called these days. And we look at it from the point of view, Irene, of economists, because we see value in experiences. That's what we think value is. It's an experience. You look through that lens too, but also through the service science lens, which is about how do we best integrate all of our resources of creators and providers and customers to create a desired service and a value experience. So we'll integrate those 2 points of view and a lot more today. Maybe you can just, for our listeners, give a quick background and your broad expertise in both of these fields, just so that they understand the context here.
Right. So, hi, everyone. I am a professor at the University of Warwick. I'm also a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, a senior member of college at Wolfson College, Cambridge, and the CEO of DataSwift, a personal data platform. My area is in, Hunter, you're absolutely right. It's market design economics. And so the design of markets, design of service ecosystems, and also the design of sort of mechanisms and incentives that come with it, plus boundaries and transactions. But also a lot of my work is around the service of things. And I like to think of being it, when we talk about service, is the service to humanity. And what does that mean? Well, that encompasses everything from the planet around us to the things we make and build to the experience we have with the things and people that surround them. So I've spent about good 20 years in the field, having spent a lot of my time partially as a business and economic model consultant on how do we not just design experiences, but how do we actually create new markets and actually enable businesses to thrive in these new markets that are well aligned towards the service of experience and people. And very much spent a good number of years in defense, designing some really complex ecosystems of multi-party big data for coordination, and then moving into a lot of the consumer IoT spaces where it's all about designing ecosystems with the right kind of rights and assets so that the incentives can be designed better and we're just more aligned to make things work better for everyone without having to deal with some of what the economists call externalities that will come out of it just because you don't design these ecosystems right. So that's me.
Well, great. It's really exciting, I think, Irene, to just talk in terms of designing experiences and designing markets. So we'll see if we can tease some of that out today. I'd like to start with a couple of definitions. You've talked about service ecosystems, and in one of the papers I read of yours, you call it, that's a worldview. Thinking in ecosystems is a worldview. So tell us about how to think about service ecosystems. What kind of a mindset is that, or a worldview is that?
And so it's interesting. We have we have been taught since very young to have a object view of the world. In English we call it nouns. They are nouns. They're like objects. If I ask you to describe this room, you'd probably immediately go towards, oh, there's a chair, there's a piano, there's a sofa, there's a TV. We immediately gravitate towards a noun, object based of the world. But what makes us have meaning and purpose aren't the nouns, it's the verbs. So if I say, please describe this room to me in verbs, you'd say breathing, talking, air moving. You describe a very different world, but that's not our worldview. Our worldview emphasizes and almost colonized us into thinking of a noun-based world. And if you think about economics, it almost have completely set us on a noun-based view of our world. The assets that we have, the nouns, the material, the thing, those are things that we are supposed to find precious, what we own, our property, because they come with property rights. But a service ecosystem believes in a worldview that's not just about verbs, but about, because verbs are connecting things and people. I play the piano, I drink tea, and verbs connect people and things and all the objects. And these invisible connections are the service of people and things. So verb is a service. Verb is action. And a service ecosystem worldview is a worldview of the verbs, the connections, the flows. So almost like in a matrix-like world, you see matrix, and then when finally he gets that kind of enlightenment, he sees these ones and zeros. If we saw the world as verbs and interactions, we now have a worldview of what we do impacts on what other people do and impacts on how they behave and how things are created. And then when you then bring it back to the design view, perhaps then it's not about the design of the object or the thing, but design of what it can do. And so comes to, of course, the sort of Gibbons, is it Gibbons? On the agency aspect of that. But yeah, that's the service ecosystem worldview.
And now we have this emerging technology field, the Internet of Things, and that gives us new connections and new flows in that ecosystem. So let's get into the Internet of Things, Irene, and tell us how you define that. And then we're going to talk about what I read in one of your papers was 4 capacities of the Internet of Things that helps you with the design. But tell us about the Internet of Things from your perspective, from that service systems perspective.
So you probably have to remind me about the 4 capacities, but
I will.
Yes, okay. So it's interesting because the Internet of Things make technological possibility to what have previously been social. So if you did all these verbs and collected everything in a context, you as a person is the connector between the toaster, the bread, the marmalade, and you made that toast. You connected them all with verbs, with actions. Now you've got these smart things. And I think the question is, how would that enhance the capability of what you would normally do yourself? And I think people don't realize that they're not really starting from a baseline of 0 here. And this is one of the worst design things I've ever seen, which is, how do I get a door to open itself? But what's wrong with your pair of hands? Why can't you open the door yourself? Well, it'd be nice and cool if it could just be automated as I approached that it opens. Yes, but honestly, it wasn't too much of an effort to just open it yourself. Right. So what you need to think about is how and when would that really help me as a human person for the door to open itself? Well, when I came back with a lot of supermarket shopping, it'd be nice if it opened for me. But then that changes the problem space, you see, in the design of that door. Not that can I open it on it, can it open on its own, but how then do you understand when I need help? And the problem with when you design connected things, you forget we've always had connected things. They were just not technologically connected, but they were connected. That toothbrush, on that toothbrush holder with that tap and the water and the sink, they were all connected when I brushed my teeth. Now, just because they're now IoT enabled doesn't change the fact that you still have to think about the lived experience, about how they were previously connected. And so if you really are serious about IoT, it's not then about, how do I switch on that light from a hub? It's a completely different engineering problem. And I think sometimes we just have to step back a little bit and ask ourselves, have we really described that problem space well enough? Or have we just leapt into what we think the problem is?
Yep. Well, we'll get into problem spaces and the idea of situations and spatial design and so on. But I did want to go through quickly these 4 capacities. You actually called them conceptualizations, but I cheated to make the word shorter, Irene. And the first one you called liquefaction of information. So generating and processing digital data about physical objects, and that gets us into the opportunity for new offerings. So liquefaction of information. What were you thinking of when you called it liquefaction?
That is so fascinating in an IoT world. I mean, I remember when the first IoT enhanced ice cubes came along, and you could sort of or was it mug, or where you could put it into a pint of something, and then it would tell the bartender when you're running a bit low on your drink,
Yeah, took me up.
and the fact that a sensor on the door will tell you when the door is open or closed. Liquefaction is basically some physical state or change in a physical state is converted into data that can then be used somewhere else. And it's powerful. It changes a toilet, when you put a sensor in there, from a toilet to a well-being health sensor of perhaps analyzing urine and early onset diabetes. I mean, that thing, which was a toilet, has now become a health device. And the ability for physical things to manifest its change of states or states in its material changes, liquefying that information into a data space and making that available somewhere else, in essence, changes the role of that thing in someone's lived experience. And that, it changes doors to become security artifacts. It changes everything. So I think the closest description, perhaps, if you think about how we used to listen to music differently on a CD or a cassette tape, and all of a sudden the music is liquefied in some way. It's out of its physical. You don't need that CD anymore. You don't need the cassette tape. It sits somewhere. Now it can go everywhere. Look at now the way we consume music. We have playlists for the gym. We have playlists for running, for summer barbecues. We've put together these liquefied things in different ways to create different offerings. And the power of that is you then start to build really interesting offerings that are connected and not within its own object. So you almost now make an object world, a noun-based world, a noun and verb-based world. So this becomes possible. And there are so many examples of this happening in the world today that could help us connect, and at scale as well. So this could help coordination of everything, because if we were willing to, we could solve things collectively at scale. And I think the pandemic has given us how that was possible. It would never have been possible if we didn't have the internet, didn't have the digital economy to coordinate en masse like that. And that's to do with that liquefaction of information.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
Yeah, and I think you've in that description, you've covered a couple of other things that I had in my list. One was digital materiality, which the physical things can become digital. The example I used in my mind was that I liked in your paper was a running jacket. Now my running jacket can have sensors in it and can tell me where I am and how fast I'm going and what my heart rate is and things like that. And the other one was about assembly, which I think you've implied that you can assemble a lot of these single IoT object into a system.
Yeah, and I think we have to be really, and we need to really understand how that system changes our reality and worldview. Professor Yang Jin-Yu at Case Western loves to talk about the what did he say? Ontological inversion, where he says that the digital holds the truth and not the physical anymore. And we saw that in the days where if you had a boarding pass, you lost it, you're dead. Forget it, it's gone. Today, you lose your boarding pass. Who cares? Go print yourself out another one. So the digital is real. The physical isn't. It's just a manifestation of and that ontological inversion is happening in the way we start to talk about this kind of digital materiality, the way that inversion is framing our reality. We believe it when we see it in the digital realm, and the physical one is just something you could print.
Fascinating. One more thing on my list that I wanted you to talk about, Irene, was you talk about crossing points, that a module data can cross from one module to another. Your example of the door and the shopping bags was kind of one, right? The module of shopping crosses into the module of getting into the home. But tell us about crossing points. That seems important.
This is actually from Carlos Baldwin's work on where do transactions come from. It's a wonderful paper if you've not read it, and talk about thick crossing points and thin crossing points. I think I talked about it a lot in my book as well, to talk about when you design, where do you decide to have a transaction. I think Baldwin, certainly in her paper, has talked about how you design for a crossing points. The very simple way I explain it, and I know it's not explained like that, but I like to explain it in this way to make it easier to understand. Imagine you are a mom and dad, and you've got a baby, and the baby has come. Oh, it's like the baby's here, and the first week is hell. What do we do? And there is what we call thick crossing points. There is no way you can process map this, not at all, because whatever I do will depend on what my husband does, and whatever he does will depend on what I do. It's very interactive in that sense. And so baby does something, and so there's all kinds of thick crossing points, meaning that there's a process, but it's not mappable, it's not sequential, it's not linear, it's interactive. And that's what it's called thick crossing points. A thin crossing point is now you've all done it. You kind of weaved yourself, baby, mom, dad, into a dance, and you are all right because you're still interactive, but you kind of have a rhythm now in the third week. And you realize he's got to go back to work. So do you. And you go, oh, darn it. We've got to go back to work. We've got a dance going, but that assumes both of us are literally looking after the baby full time. So we can't do that. We've got to get back to work. And so you think we should have a nanny. Now, this is what human people do when you design experiences. You go like, all right, the nanny can't do this dance with us. She can't come in. It's very hard. So you've got to modularize this dance that we have and make a module so that she can come in and just deliver us a capability. A simple one. Maybe it is at 7:00, we'll pass baby to her for feeding. And then she'll pass back at some point so that we can just go and do some work before. And so that passing over is a thin crossing point. That transaction is a payable one. So now that boundary becomes a boundary where a resource can enter a system, of which can grow and expand capability of the system, of which then can be chargeable. Now, the question for the holy grail when we design ecosystem is to say, oh no, where shall we put that boundary? In a thick crossing system, how do we modularize it? Where is the boundary? Because where there is a boundary, it generates usually a market. Hence a market for nannies, right? And so in almost all ecosystems that introduces a new resource, a market gets created at the point of a transacting boundary. Kind of linked between things and thing crossing points and verbs and everything down to kind of market.
Yeah. So one of the phrases that warmed my heart as an economist was, he said, given all of these elements that you've just described, including something called internet connected constituents, so we can think about building those all up together, you said that the designer has to think through the human desired experience in those contexts that you've just described, like the new baby, in order to design an IoT system that can make it better. So I've got to be human. I've got to be empathetic, right? I've got to be a designer in that sense.
We are the best sensors in the world. The human being is the best sensor. There is no sensor you can build that is better than a human being. There are better robots that will do repetitive tasks. We can't do that very well. Past 20 minutes, you'll probably be better. The robot will be probably better. But in sensing, we are far more profound in our ability to sense. Now, when you come into an Internet of Things world, there is a tendency to think of the human as that being outside of the sensor system. That's totally wrong. The human is the master sensor, is the super sensor of the system, is endogenous to the system you design. The question is, do you know how to design a system that includes the human as the sensor? Because he is both an input and an output. And he is also the person who judges the value of the system quite often. And so you've got now a particular constituent, whether it's an internet connected constituent, and we are internet connected the moment our device that becomes some kind of morph version of me comes into play. And clearly you see with all the work on contact tracing, how much of we being internet connected constituents that was, and how badly that played out in that world. But yeah, you have to think about human as the empathetic sensor, the kind of very well-tuned, multi-dimensional sensor. And how then, when you design experiences, do you use sensors or Internet of Things to amplify and support a human system, not in terms of function alone, because I can switch on the light, but in terms of the experience of when the decision support system has to kick in.
Yeah, and you mentioned a way of thinking that marketers have to perhaps change or incorporate, is a better word, into their thinking. So we grew up as marketers thinking of people sometimes as segments, they're early adopters or late adopters or something like that, or we think of them as seekers of social approbation, and we use that trait. But you say now we've got to add this idea of situational traits, that people are in situations, and that's the way to enter the space and think about the experience they want. Yes?
I mean, if you look at marketing, what has been the data for the last 100 years? We have had very poor data. The moment we buy, that's pretty much all the data we've got. So the journey of the consumer literally just ends at the point of purchase. It is terrible. We do not have good data at the point of consumption. We just don't. So therefore, we draw the transaction boundary where we have had data stop on us. So the data that stops is at the point of transaction, buying. So you got supermarket scanner data. Yes, you got EPOS data. You got all this data. Fantastic. But now you've got internet connected constituents. You've got data of people consuming, experiencing all the things in the home and everywhere. Now, what does that say to a marketer? Your segment targeting has been always focused on purchase.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't have anything beyond that. And there has been benefit segmentation, but it's still around purchase and benefits of purchase. Now, this comes to the ability to say, well, if there's more data, then I'm not that concerned perhaps about attitude, motivation, beliefs, and intent to purchase. Perhaps I'd like to see how they consume, deplete, use, interact, to then understand perhaps that if you take it simply, if I knew I was if I was selling towels, and I knew there were 4 types of towel consumers who use their towel in different ways, you would now have a different way of looking at segmentation besides purchase behavior. So extending the data well beyond purchase gives marketers a whole new world to understand their consumers beyond purchase. No one's even touching that, sir. No one is even getting there. IoT currently still stays in a very technology IoT world. The marketing community, heck, even the supply chain community, still describes the last mile as that to get to your purchase. It's like a blank wall after a purchase.
Well, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that, but that we at least in our world, we're highly conscious of that, Irene. We talk about value. The value experience is a process, and a lot of it takes place after purchase, as you say. I'm experiencing this. I've got to understand what context my consumer is in, what mood they're in. How do they evaluate that experience? When do they evaluate it? After they've consumed, or how do they evaluate in a relative sense to what their expectations were? I think the data was qualitative, right? I do ethnography, I do focus groups, I do one-on-one interviews.
And self-reported.
Are you saying that now it's becoming much more quantitative, or the data is becoming of a different quality because of the IoT and the sensors?
And self-reporting and qualitative assumes, from a fundamental research perspective, assumes awareness. The things we consume, we are not aware. We're not that aware. I mean, if somebody asks me, how much water do you drink in a day? Really? We're not that aware. But this little thing is aware. So I drink, and it's all constantly sort of lights up and tell me, drink, but
just for the visual reference, Irene's holding up her IoT water bottle.
Oh, yes. I forgot. Yes,
That's okay.
I'm holding up my little water bottle that sort of flashes a green light at me, telling me to drink my 2 liters of water a day.
Yeah.
And this is what I mean. We are aware sometimes, and for there is a bias as well about the things we are aware about and the things we're not. But IoT gives us the perspective of how we consume without that awareness, that we learn about how we value these experiences in a different way, particularly when they start to become connected as well. Yes, It does shift something quantitatively psychological to something quantitatively sociological.
Yeah.
which which is very different. And that's the reason psychological quantitative studies tend to prize attitude, intent. It tends to take the human person as a hegemony, um, on the person, whereas sociological quantitative data tends to be much more around the context and the situation of what's around me and what I interact with. So in a way, it's quite a shift in even methodology, even though it's quantitative.
Yeah, and you've said that marketers need to acknowledge that. They've got a big change they have to go through to live in this new world.
They're very good. So a lot of marketers are now either psychosocial or psychological marketers, where they understand the role of the human agent as well as the context and the norms that they sit under. And I think since the time I wrote the paper, at least till now, you start to see a greater awareness of the multi methods that come in that informs that way of thinking. So no longer is it all psychology. It is always something psychosocial or social psychology or something.
And then one of the promises for the future is that the IoT and the sensors will be able to monitor sentiment, Irene, which is kind of a marketer's dream, right? I can understand the mood of my consumer while they're consuming or after they're consuming. How positive are you about the ability to monitor sentiment in the future?
One of the reasons why we build a technology where each individual person could own their own server was I saw a technology where this would be wanted, but I saw market failure. I saw market failure because there will never be a world where we will allow this data and that amount of data to be collected about us to get all these inferences, unless there was a fundamental change in the way the technology is structured that allowed full ownership of all my data by me. And so we started that journey to create it. But if that became possible and you created and you owned everything about you, and there were wonderful ways of which it could be analyzed that only you had it first and someone could have it second because you chose to, then yes, that market failure could be eradicated, could be stopped. You could have a market form around mood and sentiment. For example, you could say, yeah, let me just give you 6 months of last year where I interacted with something, the thing that you're selling with my mood. And you could have my 6 months of last year. You didn't even need my identity. I'll give you willingly because it would be a contribution to how you learn about how I consume and the mood. But I wouldn't give you live what I'm doing right now with your product and my sentiment, where you can track me, you can collect it, and you can use it. I wouldn't do that. And so if I'm not willing to do that now, and you can't have any technological way to assure me, then the market fails.
Yeah. But what form will the sentiment data take, Irene? Will it be derivative? I must have liked that because I used it a lot. Or will it be primary? I'm sensing heartbeat or mental processes of some kind.
There are what I call substrates. Substrate is a time series data about a human person. That's my definition. Okay. It means, and we don't have that many time series data about me. We don't have that many substrates. A simple substrate is my location. I'm always in a location. So it's a time series. I can produce a time series data set of my location wherever I am. And that just gives you location. Now, that substrate, you can layer on top of it, for example, weather. Now you can say, all right, Irene, where you were, the weather was this. And you could infer, yes, how my mood from the fact that, oh my God, I'm in this rubbish weather, or whatever it is you could. But there are other substrates. The second substrate you would have is my heartbeat. Assuming that I'm always alive, it is also a good substrate. Now you have a second substrate, which is my heartbeat And now you have one substrate, which is my location, heartbeat and location, right? Now, the human body has many, many sensors that in an IoT world is starting to be able to produce pacemakers and all sorts of things, even things that could produces different kinds of substrates. The data model that you create to infer whether it's mood is already there. You can see that in risks and things that you wear, or your wearables. They create different kind of time series substrate data set. Now, how I feel about consuming something and what am I consuming does a lot depend on the assemblage. So, the cup of tea that I made, it's the tea, it's the water, it's an assemblage. Very few products are interacted upon or consumed or experienced wholly on its own. So then now you have an attribution problem. So you have an attribution. I didn't have a great consumption experience with my Oral-B toothbrush. Why? Is it because of me? I don't know how to use it. My sink is too small. The water coming out is horrible. I mean,
Yeah, I didn't like the toothpaste.
Yeah, or what it is, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is why people get into all kinds of knots when they think about consumer experiences and satisfaction. And you never get one simple model because for satisfaction or understanding lived and consumed experience, because they don't take the assemblage into account. In a world of IoT, you can take assemblage into account. You can at least try to control for assemblages. You imagine a world when you say people with small sinks generally do not have good experience with toothbrush. Hey, I don't know. It could be. But what I'm saying is you just get richer data set to be able to understand. And then, as you say, design experiences better around these assemblages.
Yeah. Well, and you also say we can design markets. In fact, that's what you do, Irene. You're a designer of new markets. And that's a hard idea for an economist, certainly, to think about. We've been told for years that markets are structures, they've got boundaries, and we define them numerically in that kind of a way. Are you thinking about markets in a different sense? What's a market that you would design in this new world of IoT?
I mean, I think about designing markets. I'm not the one who invented. I mean, Al Roth, he got the Nobel Prize for designing the kidney market, and he wrote this wonderful paper on design economics and how microeconomic engineering can be used for the design of markets. I think many economists tends to look at the world through a rear view mirror. And it's a rear view mirror is certainly very useful, but unfortunately, it's just a rear view mirror, and a lot of economics tends to be rear view mirror because the future has no data. So, but if you then think about driving forward, then you can be an executor of change. You can executor of reducing externalities, reducing some of the by really thinking about the artifacts of the market and think about how you could redesign the market better. So in Al Roth's work, of course, he had a repugnant market. He had kidneys. God, you don't start a marketplace for kidneys. That's just a terrible market, right? You don't go and say, I've got kidneys for sale. But he effectively managed to design a wonderful kidney chain model that allow people who are waiting for kidneys to reduce their wait from 3 years to 6 months. He redesigned a market for people who wanted kidneys to be not repugnant, to be able to contract and transact on kidneys in a way that actually made the market form and become better for it. I think when you are an economist and you are a design economist, you have to think about these things. You have a different set of mechanisms to work with, a different kind of constructs. You have to think about thick and thin crossing points all the time. And especially I work with the internet. The internet is very egalitarian, very flat, data flows everywhere. It's kind of messy. It's like water coming down a mountain. It finds its path of least resistance, and all of a sudden, 100 logos on EdTech became 7,800 logos on MarTech. I mean, it's just what happens. Software just happens. But even with water coming down a mountain, if you construct some boulders here and there, push it a little bit, get it into a stream, make that stream into a river, and then put a dam for get energy, right? So that's metaphorically how a market is designed. It's being intervened on, pushed into a different way, push some artifacts here. And that's what I use technology for. When you've got a technology for something that creates an economic structural institution, such as personal data ownership by individuals that through a server, you then introduce that, and then you watch how, or you design how data flows could be orchestrated differently and into a kind of river in a different way, into a zone. This is what we do. And then have those transactions at different places. And let's see whether people will take to it. Markets are not they are not deterministic at all. They are interventionistic. And so they do depend on value that's being created, the experiences that's being enjoyed. But you could try to orchestrate it in such a way that it forms transactions at different places, and in so doing just reduce some of these externalities that you see.
So I'm looking for a way to sum up, Irene, because you've opened up whole new worlds to us here, for which we're very grateful. My thought was, let's leave the idea with our entrepreneurial audience that they should think as experienced designers, that's what the IoT and technology and service science enables them to do now, is design better experiences for their customers. But maybe that's a bit too simplistic. Maybe they should be designing markets. But how would you have people think about what the entrepreneur in the future is going to be doing?
So I think I think I mentioned this to my team before. Every good entrepreneur knows that, like every good magician, knows that 80% of his trick is in the setup. It's always in the setup. 80% of it is in the setup. You set it up right, people will believe, and that trick will just happen, And
we call that a value proposition, Irene.
It's actually a bit wider than value proposition. A good entrepreneur knows his market drivers and his opportunities. That's standard for every opportunity. It's in his pitch deck when he wants to, basically pitch his proposition. And people think light of market drivers and opportunity. They'll say, oh, the world is happening like this, and then straight away go into their proposition. Actually, no. What they should really think about is to market drivers and opportunities are actually the way you shape the mountain. To say that the mountain is like this. And if you decide that, if you talk about market drivers and you talk about opportunities the way you talk about the mountain, the natural place it would land would be your proposition. That's your trick, right? You would have sold your proposition without ever having to sell it if you have shown the world that is the way the water is flowing. I've just put boulders, and that how we got to stop the water from doing this and that, because it's doing all kinds of things here. And in the end, here's the trick. Well, that's the proposition. And everybody goes like, oh yeah, we totally needed that. And this is why that setup is all about the market. If you can tell the story of where and how the market is going, the fact that you have a thesis about how the market is going, it's creating all kinds of problems here, it's creating all kinds of problems there, no one solved that, no one's done this, it is a total mess. You basically set it up for yourself. So I think entrepreneurs could really think about that market of which they are entering into. much more, much more in depth, because that will just get them more funding. At the end, that's the entrepreneur who has to just raise the money for his idea, right?
Yeah. I have the idea of the water is flowing in the direction of more entrepreneurship, Irene. That's my mark.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's a very good reason. So let me tell you the market driver for that one.
Please.
So I wrote a paper. It's a very small paper called "The Future of Work," and for the future, it's actually called "Mimicking Firms." So the simple market driver for that is that the human person cannot take rents, cannot take money unless it's wage. There is no other money you can take except wage, a salary. Yeah. There is no institution that will take anything for you except wage. So if you wanted to enhance your capability to get money, you can't do it with wage. You have to be a firm. A firm can take capital, technology, and labor. A human person can only take labor. Now, by natural consequence of that, every person who wants to enhance capability will have to mimic a firm. So, I used to use an example to say, imagine I was a factory worker somewhere in Asia, and I was separating husk from nut for cashew nuts. And I went in and I separated about 10 kilograms a day. Overnight, I went to my garage and built this amazing robotic hand. And I went in, I put my hand down onto that factory floor to separate 1,000 kilograms. What do you think I become? A bigger wage earner? No, I'll be the outsourced company. Mm-hmm. The natural tendency for every human being to be an entrepreneur is the nature of our economic institutions that do not allow human beings to take anything more than being a wage earner. That's not a failure of the person, it's a failure of our economic institutions of being able to take all kinds of resources as a firm, but nothing as a human person. That's why you see everybody becoming an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. That's our ambition. Everyone is an entrepreneur. Irene, I'm going to wrap it up here just for time purposes, but thank you so much for taking us through this.
It has been a pleasure. Thanks for asking all those wonderful questions, Hunter.
Good. And maybe one day we can have you back and talk about the world going to all entrepreneurship.
Yeah, one day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.